The early to mid 2000s were a pretty interesting time for animation, with computer-generated movies becoming more commonplace as 2D animation was slowly being replaced. Us 20-something-year-olds got to see a pretty big change in the industry. Think about it, we got to experience such classics as The Emperor's New Groove, The Road to El Dorado, and so many other great 2D films alongside movies like Jimmy Neutron, Monsters Inc., and The Green Ogre himself. Shrek, a character nearly as iconic as that one song. But when people talk about great computer-generated animation, there's usually a name I don't really hear in the discussion. Today we're going to be talking about Hoodwinked, a movie that I think most people don't really give a fair chance. And helping me out today is the guy who I've really got the pleasure to know recently, Dalsmik, someone who has a lot more knowledge on reviewing movies than I do, so make sure you give him a warm welcome.
Yo, what's good? I'm Dalsmik, here to talk about why Hoodwinked is the second coming of Christ and why you all need to convert this holiday season. For anyone who isn't entirely familiar with the film, Hoodwinked is an independently funded animated movie that takes the fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood and turns it into a non-linear whodunit style mystery. It was inspired by the likes of Rashomon and Pulp Fiction, quite an odd place to draw inspiration for a children's movie, but I'm down for that either way.
The development cycle for this movie is actually pretty interesting. Whereas in normal movies, the film and everything around it usually has separate funding from other sources, this movie was completely independently funded, which also unfortunately means they didn't have the budget to change things around to make it the best movie they could, as the first script written was also pretty well the last, since they couldn't change the animation after making the script more concrete. For comparison, other animated films by say Disney or Pixar at the time could afford to scrap the entire third act and reanimate it, with that even being commonplace. This movie really couldn't afford that luxury, so the third act kind of fumbles a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean a lot.
Another interesting detail about the animation that I discovered through an article is how they designed the models. Hoodwinked's characters were designed to look like 1960s stop-motion films, stuff like Rudolph. It's a really creative decision. Sadly, I don't think it translated well with the end results. They all look like my teenage science projects. My lab assistant, Professor Leiter, would love the aesthetic of this film, but I'm not a fan. The animation budget seemed too limited to properly adapt such a solid idea. Though despite the fact that this movie was independently funded, the Weinstein Company decided to pick it up for distribution after a screening of Hoodwinked at Cannes Film Festival, which also prompted some recasting. A lot of big-name actors were thrown into the mix, and ultimately helped promote the film to a wider audience. And promoted this film it did, because Hoodwinked made more than 13 times its budget back in the box office, thanks to this arrangement. If it weren't for Robert Rodriguez's wife blowing the whistle, then I doubt anyone would know about the existence of Hoodwinked.
So now that people know about the film, and it has some big name actors to go along with it, how did it do at the box office? Well, it did surprisingly well actually. It made back double the film's budget in its opening weekend. In fact, it was ranked number 2 at the box office, coming only $50,000 short under the number 1 movie that weekend, Glory Road. At the end of the theatrical run, the movie managed to make $51 million in the USA and $58 million in other areas. The critical reception to this film was very mixed at the time of its release, with many critics comparing it to a more lackluster Shrek ripoff with some similar storytelling themes. And then there were obviously a lot of critics who weren't pleased with the animation, which is understandable to say the least. However, the movie did have a semi-valid excuse for the rough animation. Its budget was pretty low. In fact, for comparison, Shrek 1 had a budget of $60 million, and this movie had a budget of $8 million. So you can kind of start to piece together how expensive movie making can be, and how many shortcuts they had to make for this movie. Now with that all said, we can finally start discussing the plot of the movie itself.
So, as I described before, Hoodwinked tells its story out of order as 4 characters recall their involvement in a larger plot. It's the story of the Little Red Riding Hood, except all of the key players are being interrogated by police. This is the bridge that pieces together not only the original fable, but all of the additional story elements introduced into the script. The woodland town they live in contains many bakeries and beloved food establishments that have their recipes stolen by a goody bandit. Because of this, many businesses are closing up shop. Red, the wolf, the woodsman, and the grandma each have a connection to this core premise. Granny Puckett owns the most renowned of all the goody shops in the forest. Red is her delivery girl, the wolf is an investigative journalist trying to track the bandit, and the woodsman is also there, I guess. He's a method actor by day, meat distributor by night, up until his business becomes a victim of the Goody Bandit. Interspliced between each of these characters' testimonies are clues giving subtle hints to identify who the Goody Bandit is, whether it's one of the four characters or someone else entirely.
The biggest thing that makes this movie stand out is we get to see the same story a few different times from conflicting perspectives. For example, in some of these viewpoints, events play out entirely differently due to how the characters view them. Our first look into the entire mystery comes from Red Puckett, the girl in red herself, as she wants to prove herself as an independent individual who really just wants to be let free into the world. Unfortunately, she is stuck in the forest doing her everyday routine as a delivery girl. This is all well and good until one day the Goody Bandit decides to let her know that her grandma's sweets are going to be the next victims of their thievery. This leads Red to finally decide she needs to leave the forest so she can help protect the recipes by taking them up to Grandma's house. Quite a large expansion on the original book's plot, I would say. On her way up, she gets to meet some colorful characters that we'll continue to get to see throughout the other characters' perspectives. A large part of this movie's comedy is actually getting fake outs from one character's perspective to another's, which I think is a pretty unique way of doing humor. For example, after Red leaves the forest, well, at least the outer forest, she eventually runs into Wolf, and while she sees him as a pretty big threat, we later find out various circumstances just make him seem that way. On Red's journey, she runs into such colorful characters such as BB Wolf, I Was Prepared, Angry Wabbit, Kinky Grandma, and Psycho. As we get an expansion on the original fairy tale, for the most part, Red's story is pretty consistent with what we know from the fable, and now that we get the general setup of the plot, this is where things start to get interesting.
I'll be honest, the Wolf's testimony is probably my favorite of the bunch and the best aspect of the film. It's an interesting take on the original tale while adding a playful modern slant to what used to be a straightforward antagonist. And being voiced by Patrick Warburton kinda helps that. He's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, call you Wolf? You can call me Sheila. I like long walks and fresh flowers.
Quit playing around, Wolf!
So the Wolf is a journalist who puts on disguises for a living in order to obtain information for any scoop that he's working on. His current assignment is on the identity of the Goody Bandit, though from his perspective, his investigation leads him to believe that both Red and Granny Puckett are up to no good. With the help of his annoying squirrel photographer Twitchy, the two set off to track down Red on her deliveries. He confronts her as shown in Red's story, which shows a more comedic slapstick perspective than what was previously established, and eventually leads to his keister getting tenderized. After he gets info from Angry Bugs Bunny that there's a decent shortcut to get to Granny Puckett's house, it eventually leads them to Japheth the Goat's mineshaft trails. They hop aboard one of the carts, get themselves into a dynamite incident, and then make their way to Granny's house. As it turns out, Granny is already tied up though, so all in all, it flips the previous testimony on its head, but still leaves the other elements open to mystery. The segment's really well done overall, but how does the next one hold up?
Our third perspective covers the Woodsman, a failing actor who has one last chance to get a starring role in a Bunyan commercial. His story is a bit weird compared to the others, to say the least, because it's just so out there. Everyone else has some sort of deep connection to each other, like Granny and Red are related, and Wolf is making a news report on the bandit who he believes is them, that it really makes a foot cream actor seem kind of out of place. Pair that alongside a song about giving his meat to children, and you have a pretty wild story in the midst of all the mystery. And honestly, I think that actually kind of works for this fable. A lot of detective novels and other mysteries usually have some sort of fake out, or a way to misdirect the audience, and that's pretty well what this is here. However, since it's a kids movie, they can't really do it too subtly, so having a random man show up at the crime scene is definitely something that's realistic, but also comedic. I don't think it's anyone's favorite part of the movie, but I think for what it is, it works. And now for our final testimony, we get to see perhaps the most unique character change out of all of the fairy tale characters.
That's right, Granny Puckett, owner of her own famous goodie shop, who also happens to be a Bam Margera level X Games athlete. She's the hip, badass force of nature grandma, and I don't really recall if there were a lot of cartoons or films at the time that pulled this trope off, other than maybe the Proud Family, so I guess I'm gonna give it a pass. Her story is probably the shortest to cover since she just participates in a skiing competition. This is where the Goody Bandits henchmen are introduced. A group of 4 people have to sabotage Granny in this competition, and then move on to take out Red. Granny responds by starting a goddamn avalanche. Something that appears in the Wolves and Red story in some fashion, but I guess Granny was the real G. She succeeds in winning the competition, takes out the henchmen, and possibly commits mass murder from starting a natural disaster, but it's not murder if it's animals, I suppose, just very unsportsmanlike hunting. She then gets away by using her Go-Go Gadget parachute, gives Red some Obi-Wan style advice.
Use the hood, Red. Use the hood.
And then heads home. Her ceiling fan is actually what ties her up with her parachute and sends her in the closet. Somehow. And then she breaks down the door using Twitchy the squirrel as a weapon. Yeah, I'm serious, that happens too. Maybe I'm not an expert on mystery stories, but this was probably my least favorite element in the movie. There's not a whole lot going with it, shy of a detail or two regarding the main plot. The connection to who's the Goody Bandit doesn't even feel strong here. We know he has henchmen, I guess, but the rest is just a sports competition and population control. I'm glad the last 3 were as decent as they were at the very least.
Yeah, now that you mention it, the Granny storyline was actually pretty dumb for reasons outside of an 80-plus-year-old woman doing extreme sports. We find out she's holding Red back in the forest due to the outside world being too dangerous, while at the same time Old Lady Puckett is saying fuck it and causing avalanches during an extreme skiing competition. Alongside that, we also get to see all the Puckett women going off on their own adventures, and I start to wonder if I'm watching Granny Puckett or Mother Gothel. It's just a generally dumb plot point, but you want to know what makes it even worse? We get one of my least favorite cliches in any movie. Tell me if you've heard this before. The movie's plot is about to be resolved, and then the gang has to split up over a silly disagreement, just to cause that last bit of drama and extend the runtime. God, I hate it. So in the third act, Red is rightfully pissed at her grandma due to Granny lying to her for years about her hobby, and this leads to her leaving the house because of course it does. You can usually tell these moments happen just to make the movie reach the runtime, but still it's an annoying plot. And what makes it even worse is Red's leaving a crime scene while the police are interrogating them. That has to be illegal. So as Red is moping, learning her entire life is a lie, she eventually sees the henchman that tried stopping Granny during the extreme sports competition being directed by none other than the surprise true villain of this movie, the Bunyan Cream director. No, Boingo the Rabbit. Who would be a pretty good twist villain with some subtle build-up if we didn't get the shot of him in the first 20 minutes of the movie. Red doing what any sane person would do, blows her cover in the middle of the bad guy's hideout in the middle of nowhere. But surprise, surprise, the villain and his henchmen, who, let me remind you, outnumber Red 4-1, capture her. What's surprising is Boingo actually takes her on in a fair fight. So why does he act like he always gets picked on? He can obviously take care of himself. You know what? The third act might actually bring this movie down a bit. It at least had this awesome evil laugh, so I'll cut it some slack. So, what is Boingo's big plan?
Oh, Stuffy, I'm very happy you asked. So Angry Bugs Bunny has decided he doesn't want to take orders from anyone anymore, and in order to make that happen, he wants to take over the forest. We get a villain song, and then he plans to kill Red. Looks like he's trying to get his body count up to Granny's level. Fortunately, the others manage to find the hideout from the Schnitzel truck of all things, and everyone gets a moment to shine, except the woodsman, of course. For Christ's sake, Twitchy got to save the day more than he did, and he was the movie's minion before minions were even a thing.
While Doll is fuming, we get to see Granny show off some more of her skills. She saves Red, and Red's like, yeah, I guess I forgive you for gaslighting me all these years, and all the villains end up sliding right into the police van where the day is saved. You know, this part of the movie gave me a headache, but I still stand by my statement when I say I think this movie was better than Shrek 1. How do you feel about it, Doll?
Whew, if I had to give a quick answer as to how I feel about Hoodwinked, I'd say that I like it. It's not a perfect movie by any means, plus the comparison to Shrek is unavoidable. They have a very similar gimmick, but executed in different styles. However, the first thing I'd commend about Hoodwinked is that it has a clean sense of humor on top of having playful storytelling. That doesn't invalidate Shrek by any means, but I have to admire Corey Edwards for taking a more family-friendly approach, rather than trying to emulate what popular animated films were doing at the time. It's a a sense of humor that works for what it's going for. Not every joke is gonna land, but it got some laughs out of me for sure. I also really love the concept as a whole, turning a familiar story and flipping the whole thing on its head and giving it a new story mold. It's something I really want to see more animated movies do, specifically in similar or better ways, because there were a lot that came after this that were not very good. I also really admire the way the story itself handled the first half, though unfortunately Hoodwink gets bogged down in the later half, which is unfortunately what keeps me from really loving it. I feel like everything that happened during Granny's segment and most of the plot afterwards does not really mesh well with everything that we saw previously. Nothing huge really occurs in her story, which is odd. We know the ski team works with the bandit, but it didn't add a whole lot to the mystery other than he's got henchmen. Then we figure out that she got tied up, but after that, a forced conflict that drives Red away from the main cast, they piece together who the obvious culprit is, and then it becomes a very standard final act. Once the mystery aspect was resolved, the movie lost a lot of luster. And the soundtrack isn't very good either, a lot of really lame rock songs that definitely have an early to mid 2000s feel, and not in a good way. But still, there is a lot that I like in the first half, and that's enough to get me to rewatch it, and even to recommend it to some people, to see what they think. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say that I like it better than Shrek, since I can watch Shrek without vomiting at how gross everyone looks, but I don't entirely agree with the critics who trashed it. They seemed very dismissive, which is unfortunate since there's a lot more to the film than they really gave it credit for.
Yeah, I definitely think this movie accomplishes what it set out to accomplish by making a wholesome family mystery movie. I'm glad we both had relatively positive views when it came to this movie, and I'm really glad you agreed to come on the show and help me talk about it. I hope we can talk about something else sometime in the future. This was a really fun collab for me, and I hope you had a good time coming on the show and discussing the film.
And I thank you, Stuffy, for having me to join you in this wholesome family fun experience. What a hoot and a holler! But seriously, your ass is watching Hoodwink 2 with me. I'm taking you, and I don't care if you kick or scream.